Purnima Menon, the Senior Director of Food and Nutrition Policy at the International Food Policy Research Institute, Zainab Salbi, the co-founder of Daughters for Earth, and Geeta Sethi, World Bank Advisor and Global Lead for Food Systems. This panel discussion on women at the forefront of regenerative agriculture is moderated by FP's Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you again for being here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate what is an incredibly important discussion about not only the impact that climate change is having on women who comprise the majority of smallholder farmers in the world and who lead the work that goes into ensuring that there is food in much of the world, but especially in low and middle income countries, but also the incredibly important role that women have to play in safeguarding those systems and the ways in which regenerative agriculture can offer opportunities for the future. And we have an incredible range of expertise on this panel, and I'd love to dive right in and actually start with you, Purnima. We were just talking about this actually backstage, and I think it'd be wonderful to bring the conversation to the stage here, which is, can you help the audience understand the central role that women play in the global landscape of agriculture? And how does climate change threaten those food systems? And how can women who are part of regenerative agriculture build resilience to those shocks and ensure that their leadership is front and center of solutions going forward?
That's a mouthful of questions. So, let me start with the first. So, over the last, I'm going to say several decades now that IFPRI has been doing research on women in agriculture, we've learned a tremendous amount about not just women's roles in agriculture, but about the challenges that women face in fulfilling perhaps their potential to support agriculture of different kinds. And so, I think what we need to shine a spotlight on is the persistent gender-related inequalities that exist across the agricultural landscape. What have we learned in the last decades of implementing primarily conventional agriculture about persistent gender-related inequalities? And then we have to ask ourselves, how is that likely to play out as we look to transform agriculture itself? So, for example, we've learned that women lack access to land. That's just the most basic and fundamental requirement to engage in agriculture. We've learned that women often lack access to information, access to credit. And so, if we know that's what things look like, on the one hand, from a problem landscape. On the other hand, from a solution-scape, what we know is that when women are empowered, when women come together in communities in particular around agriculture, that they are empowered to, and they do ask for nature-positive solutions. We've seen that in our work in Kenya, we've seen that in our work in Bangladesh. So I think we're at a point now where we understand both the challenges as well as some of the solutions in space, and we understand what women themselves are interested in. So now the question is really, what are we going to do about this as we look to transform agriculture itself? Are we going to acknowledge women's roles in a really central way? Are we going to acknowledge the challenges that women face in a really central way? And are we going to deploy a set of solutions going all the way from policy to how we work with agricultural communities that break these barriers one after the other? So if you have land barriers, you really have to lean in and ask where those barriers are coming from. Are they coming from policies? Are they coming from policies and laws that actually exist but haven't been implemented? And then slowly but surely, we have to knock out each and every one of those challenges. And then I think we say, we'll see the power rise. So let me stop there. Your second question, sort of on the question of, where do women lie, what have we learned about that in the context of women in agriculture itself? I think the second question on food systems and climate change is, quite frankly, challenge of our times. How do you feed, the billions of people today and tomorrow? And how do we feed these populations with healthy diets? What we know today is that 3 billion people simply cannot afford healthy diets. We're also learning a lot about where food comes from. I'm often I'm a very pragmatic person, right? So we do a lot of research on what people eat and where their food comes from. And there is a certain centrality to markets, regardless of where we sit in community engagements in agriculture. People are engaging with the market, they are purchasing food through the market. And so even as we think about regenerative agriculture, I think we have to really think about how does what's produced in these new ways of doing agriculture end up in markets and in places that people are accessing food from. What do prices look like? What does access look like? What do gender patterns of access look like? And then I think we get to thinking about the transformative power of different forms of agriculture, intersecting with some of what we know are really big social inequality issues in shaping what the world leads forward. Okay? So huge challenges, but I think we're learning a lot. I know many people in the room are trying a lot of things on the ground. As a researcher, I'm always imploring people, invest in learning, because what you do in Kenya can be transformative if people in other parts of the world can learn about it. What women do in India can be transformative in other parts of the world, but without us investing in the learning, we lose the opportunity to share lessons.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think there's so much to unpack there in terms of the learnings, in terms of the data, in terms of the policy barriers and structural challenges. And that's definitely something I want to touch on a little bit later in the conversation. But to your point about solutions, Zainab, I'd love to turn to you next and bring you into this conversation. You have had an extraordinary career founding Women for Women International, an incredible global organization that's worked on women's agency and leadership and elevating their voices, and more recently co-founding Daughters for Earth. And throughout your career, you've often had to confront compounding challenges, whether that's conflict, whether that's climate change, so on and so forth. And so let me ask you this. Why, at this point in your career, are you so focused on ensuring that there are nature-based solutions, and how are women at the forefront of regenerative agriculture in your view? Are there any examples of promising initiatives that need to be scaled up, or anything that stands out in your mind as this is really where we need to be focusing our energy and our investments going forward?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. And as you said, I come from the conflict and humanitarian world, and as my shift to climate change and biodiversity, addressing biodiversity losses has been a relatively recent one. But when it comes to women, I see exactly the same pattern. So in the biggest unusual conflicts, women are impacted the most. 80% of refugees caused by conflicts are women, exactly the same as we are seeing in climate crisis. The most people, the biggest majority of the population that is being impacted by the climate crisis, not only in displacement, not only in food security, is actually women, right, and children. Now, I also, in my experience before, I see women leading a lot of the solutions. In conflict areas, we talk a lot about Ukraine these days. Women keep life going. But the press keeps pushing only as men see conflict. This is no, actually, I'm not even criticizing that. I am criticizing that. I'm not attacking anybody on that. But they see the conflicts as men experiencing it, weapons and all of these things. Same thing in climate change. We're addressing that issue from mostly technology perspective, right? Which is not wrong. It's just not the exclusive solution. And we're not addressing the solutions that actually have nature-based solution, and humans can lead immediately. We do not need to invent something for the future. We can do it today. And it happened to be women are leading that, right? So same in conflict, the media pays attention as men are seeing conflict, not paying attention as women are dealing with conflict, which is keeping life going. Same with crisis. We're dealing with only technology, but what women are doing, and this is a fact, are leading nature-based solutions in terms of protection of land, rivers, water, in terms of protection of biodiversity. It's actually quite amazing what they are doing, and not only on a small scale, but on a large scale. And no one is paying attention to these nature-based solutions, which we can do it today, now, and has immediate impact. And for me, as a non-scientist oriented person, it makes complete sense. When you're sick, the doctor tells you go and rest. Apparently, nature needs to rest a little bit. And that's why conservation or regenerative agriculture is essential in the solution. Now, the third thing that is a pattern in here. In conflict areas, women get 10 cents out of every dollar that goes to humanitarian world. In climate issues, women get 2 cents out of every philanthropic dollars that is going to the issue. That includes agriculture. So it doesn't add up, right? For me, it doesn't add up, because when you talk about, like, the numbers don't add up. These are people who are impacted the most. Forget about their genders. They're doing a lot of work. They're actually on the front line on both regenerative agriculture and conservation. They're getting 2 cents out of every dollar that is going to the issue. And we are by far not incorporated in the decision-making table. Not process. A colleague asked me, he said, you mean process? Like, no, we are already in the process, but we are not in the decision-making table. The final decision needs to incorporate women. Now, let's talk about agriculture particularly, because we know that this is a fact, right? It's majority of small-scale farmers in the world. We have about 43% of smallholder farmers are women. Of the farmers in the world are women. They produce 70% of the food in Africa alone, and yet they own only 20% of the world's agricultural land. Right? We have data that if women have the same access to resources as men worldwide have, they could grow 20 to 30% more food in the same amount of land they have, lifting 150 million people out of poverty. So for me, the data are there, actually, especially when it comes to women and farming, and especially when it comes to, climate and farming, all of that. What we are not correlating is the financing. Mm-hmm. And I do not understand that. It's like we are in a world that talks about scalability and large-scale solutions. When it comes to women, we immediately shift to breadcrumbs and cents, not dollars. And, you're dealing with an issue of scarcity to half of the population in the world that is essential in solving this issue that we are dealing. So for me, it's ultimately an issue of financing, because women are actually active in these changes. But we need to unless we address that, they're doing it, but we need to ultimately address and incorporate 50% of the population in these essential solutions.
I think that's a perfect segue to bring Geeta into the conversation. You are at the World Bank as the global lead on food systems, and Zainab's just provided us some really important data points, but also I think a clarion call in terms of investments and return on investments, that this is a smart strategic approach, and yet we're seeing underinvestment and a range of structural barriers. So let me ask you this. What do policy structures look like when it comes to regenerative agriculture, and where does financing for women who are in those roles fit into the picture? I'm curious to get your take on what the reality looks like, and also where you'd like to see change happen going forward in terms of policy reform and also the mobilization of those resources that are needed.
Thank you. First, it's a great pleasure to be here, and that's quite a boat full of questions, but let me try and do justice to it. Delighted to be part of this, and I see a few familiar faces. Okay, so before I go on to in terms of regenerative agriculture and why the shift is needed and the role of women, let me give a sense of probably what you all know in terms of what is wrong with the system today. One has heard often, and we are in Anga on the eve of COP28, that food systems is not fit for purpose. Today, 33% of emissions is from the sector, and it is going to be the highest emitting sector with business as usual by 2050. And yet, climate finance, which to date has been about 660 billion, 28 billion has come to this sector, which is about 3%. And when the emissions are 33. So this is a fact. The second is the points that my colleagues made here. Every second person on this planet is suffering from some element of malnutrition, either no calories, too little calories, or wrong calories. Now, a system that is so not fit for purpose in terms of the impacts on planets, violating the planetary boundaries, impact on health, can still rely on close to 800 billion a year of public support, 65% of which is distorting. You talked about 2 cents to a dollar. A farmer, a woman farmer, is getting 35 cents to the dollar right now, not climate, just. So there's not even equity in terms of living income, living wages. So the policy agenda, the repurposing of public support has to change. Right now, the biggest financiers of the food sector are domestic financing. So domestic financing needs to look very different. Now let me come to the role of, and hence the move to regenerative. That's on terms of the public support. Now on the role of the women there is no doubt, and my colleagues brought this up very clearly, that women are 60% of smallholder farmers are women. Local supply chains are being fed by what they are producing, and yet they do not have access to financing because they have no collateral, as they have no property rights. They do not have access. There's weak capacity because extension services are not catering to them. It's a big failure globally. There is an issue in terms of nutrition. Again, going back to the policy, a big agenda we've been pushing is the poverty lines. Today, the poverty lines are defined on caloric sufficiency, not nutrition sufficiency. That has to shift in a big way. But more importantly, I think for the sector to actually women are going to be the change agents. There is no doubt about that. Women are much more. Women farmers are much quicker to change direction of travel and break the inertia, right? So there has to be a program very much catered to the women farmers for the system to change in a big way. Now, to be able to do that, I think the financing, is, as I mentioned, is one big agenda. Poverty lines is the next big agenda. But I think the third very important part of the regenerative and role of women is what does a 21st century farming look like? It cannot be a single business enterprise anymore. Sources of financing, sources of income for in the regenerative agriculture world is at least three. One is on the food produced. Second is in terms of eco-services, because agriculture really means about being stewards of the land, which means that the eco-service payments have to be very much part of the finance architecture, which means there needs to be a price of carbon. It cannot be $5 a ton. It means agriculture and regen needs to be part of the carbon markets. It's not an option. And the third is renewables, in terms of really being able to produce renewables on their land and using it or putting it on the grid. So this is really the vision of the 21st century farming. And in this scenario, the big shifts that have to happen has to be on the repurposing of the public support. There is no choice there. It has to be, private finance needs to come in a very big way. It is not coming in. And I was at an event a few days ago, and I talked to my panelists about this, and it was a room full of, I think the balance sheet in that room was at least 400 billion, okay? There is money, but it's just not flowing to this sector. And the big agenda they talk about, that one hears about, is risk is very high, what are the bankable projects, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We said, all right, you want big projects? Here are three big agendas. Low emission rice. It cuts across geographic boundaries. It has a big impact on methane emission. It's a $20 billion investment. Come in. Low emission livestock. Okay, such an important source done sustainably in terms of dietary needs and so on and so forth. 35 billion come in. Agrologistics, food loss and waste. If it was a country, it would have been the third highest emitter. Okay, come in. And what did we hear? Geeta, great stuff, and so on and so forth. We're doing great work on adaptation and resilience. Like, excellent, what are you doing? Insurance products for, I said 60 million, 50 million, when the need in the sector to go in the direction we're talking about is between 350 to 400 billion a year for the next decade. And the gentleman says 65 million. Like, you're not needed there. Get the hell out of there. There are other people in that space. You come in where we need big financing. And here are three big agendas. So anyway, just to give you a flavor.
No, and you know, I think it's important to talk about these issues with humor, but also frankness, right? Like, this is the reality that you're contending with. And if the three of you who are in the positions you're in are confronting these kinds of realities, imagine what it's like for the majority of women who are literally on the front lines and trying to create that change, right? And your point, Geeta, reminds me of something that actually, Purnima, you were talking about earlier, and that's about what do we know and how do we effectively deploy information to decision makers so that we are speaking clearly about not only the reality, but also the opportunities ahead. And so the question I wanted to put to all of you actually is about data gaps and information gaps. And for example, IFPRI has done incredible research around this. The World Bank has obviously done research on these issues for a very long time. So when you think about where we need to be heading, what do you see as the key data gaps, and what do you see as the gaps in terms of information, the correct information reaching those who are moving the dollars and making the decisions?
Yeah. So let me talk about data. So there's data gaps and there's evidence gaps, right? So data gaps are critical to be filled to help us understand what's going on in this world with a 50-50 kind of mentality fully in place, right? And so we think about this in two spaces. So one is think about it from a leadership space. The global 50-50 accountability mechanism, really important for us to really keep an eye on this. And that speaks to, you know, issues of women in leadership in the world of food and agriculture. We have to keep our eyes on the ball. If we are not at the table, if we are not speaking up, if we are not in places like this and everywhere that are the other places where decisions are made, we are simply not able to bring certain agendas to the table with enough. I think we need to create space to discuss these, and women are constantly lifting other women up. And so, you know, I think paying attention to data on women and leadership is key, but also paying attention to data on what's happening, not just in farms. I think we've done a really good job on beginning to understand and measure what happens around women in agriculture, but we have to look at this across the food system, right? I mean, we have to expand our data capabilities and the insights from data on where are women included and excluded at every point in the food system. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big data agenda there. I think around the topic of regenerative agriculture and gender in particular, there's a lot of open questions on evidence per se, right? I mean, lots of things that we make assumptions, we imagine that, you know, it must be so. But what we find often, because we're doing research as our day-to-day, is that we're constantly having to question our own assumptions because the evidence points us in different directions, right? So I think we have to ask questions, for example, such as how effective are gender transformative approaches at actually reducing gender inequalities and enabling, you know, the other outcomes that we want to see from regenerative agriculture. You know, how can we use different platforms to bring women into the space and empower them? We really have to ask these questions and ask them with openness. You know, often women are we want the evidence to say that it all works when we do it, but sometimes it doesn't, and we have to understand why and understand what the constraints are. You know, so again, I think, there's the data gaps, but there's also the evidence gaps. And so as we embark on new ways of doing things, new ways of bringing women into the picture, new ways of embarking on regenerative agriculture and addressing, I think, some of the really big challenges that Geeta spoke to. And thank you, Geeta, for your nod to nutrition. I didn't have to say that even as a nutritionist in this room, which tells me we've had some impact on this world. But, even as we move in those directions, we have to take a 50-50 lens to gathering the evidence, to understanding the impacts, not just on the outcomes of healthy diets and affordability of diets and emissions, but also on the inclusiveness and the equity dimensions of these outcomes as we look forward. So I'm going to call for data and evidence for us to look forward to.
I'm not going to touch data because you just addressed that. I'm going to talk about anecdotal experiences because Daughters for Earth, our goal is to find and fund women-led climate solutions, and that actually particularly includes regenerative agriculture, conservation, and renewable energy. And when I set on that goal, I really expected most of the issues that we're going to find is going to be coming out of Africa. And it was an assumption, talk about assumption for me. And to my shock, I learned that those who are leading the shift from traditional farming to regenerative farming, and actually even shifting the farm structure into a holistic farming economy, are not only being challenged in Africa, they're being challenged everywhere. And most of them happen to be, this is anecdotal, women. And I was, to my surprise, shocked that women in Switzerland and in England and in many parts of Europe were being attacked by their own systems and other farmers when they are shifting their farming techniques and they're shifting their agriculture farms into a holistic agriculture, which food production becomes one of the way that they are producing income, right? I was honestly surprised in that shift. They were attacked by medias, by other farmers, by taxations in their economy, in their systems. So we have to address that there is a shift happening. Women are, in my opinion, taking a leadership in that shift for a variety of reasons. I think most of it is practical reasons. They are realizing that they need to do that because they have no other choice. They're getting attacked, but plus not much funding to it. I mean, we have as much demand coming from European women farmers saying, please support us, small-scale farmers, as it is from from Asia or from Africa. And so it's a big issue that we really need to address. But ultimately, for me, again, I go to the mathematics, we are talking about half of the population. We are addressing the most important challenge. I love what you said about respecting regenerative agriculture in terms of carbon credits and all of that. So we've got to incorporate, for me, it's like a practical things, but our practicality when it comes to women cannot be like we almost shift in our mind from big solutions. When it comes to women, it becomes almost small-scale solutions. So we have to be audacious in the solutions in here beside the data.
Okay, so two things, and I know you're running out of time. One is if the shift has to happen in terms of the carbon ecosystem services and getting compensated, MRV systems need to be developed. And we are very far behind versus the energy sector. And that needs to be a big focus, whether it's a multilateral institution or academics or even private sector. I think the second is this shift of the poverty line from caloric sufficiency to nutrition sufficiency means there needs to be a very clear nutrition index, or what I call, where countries don't argue and it's transparent. Otherwise, it's going to get very difficult to define the way there is no argument in terms of poverty numbers. We need that kind of clarity on nutrition. Therefore, then also align the income support programs to be nutrition sensitive. And those are some of the two big, I think, agendas in terms of the data gaps.
Thank you for that. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about this conversation, and to me it feels like we've only barely scratched the surface, is there's so many different aspects here in terms of what we need to be thinking of for solutions, not only working across sectors, but across issue areas at multiple levels. And if I may, as we close out, making sure that the voices of those who are on the ground, indigenous knowledge, the knowledge and expertise and lived experiences of women who are working the land and putting the food on the table and going to market is informing the decisions that are being made. So please join me in thanking this panel for their contributions today, and thank you also for your leadership on these issues day in and day out.
Next, please welcome to the stage Her Excellency Miriam bint Mohammed Al-Mhiri.